All right, welcome to the lecture for Jude the Obscure, parts 1 and 2. So, some historical context. Jude the Obscure takes place during the Victorian period in England, a period we still problematically date according to the reign of Queen Victoria from 1837 to 1901. According to some, but not all, English society was marked among the middle classes, especially at this time, by wide-scale sexual repression and a conservative worldview emphasizing the institution of marriage and the family unit. Murders like those of Jack the Ripper in 1888 began to desensitize the public to violence, leading to certain grisly scenes like the one that will form the climax of Jude the Obscure and which will put Hardy's realism to the test. The town of Christminster is based, as you probably know by reading the novel, on the university town of Oxford, whose colleges were only beginning to accept working-class students during Hardy's time. Hardy himself was unable to afford a university education. So, take a look at the novel, and in your own time, I encourage you to glance at the map of Wessex, which appears right after the title page, so that you can trace the wanderings of Jude in a way that now you can trace the wanderings of the biblical patriarchs and other biblical figures in maps provided in study Bibles, which I think is interesting. And you can see how every part of this novel is divided up according to a place. Of the 6 parts, there are 6 places, some repeated. So if you look at page 9, on the first page of the novel, you have a rather cryptic 3-word epigraph for the entire novel, not part first, but the entire novel, namely, the letter killeth. Our footnote tells us that this comes from the letter of St. Paul to the Corinthians, his second letter, in fact, chapter 3, verse 6. So if we take a look at that, we can see the following. Paul says to the Corinthians in chapter 3, verse 6, that God, quote, hath made us able ministers of the New Testament, not of the letter, but of the Spirit. For the letter killeth, but the Spirit giveth life. So Paul is speaking to the early Christian church in the Greek city of Corinth here, and he's contrasting the Old Covenant, that is to say, the laws inscribed on stone tablets at Mount Sinai, with a new covenant, which, he tells the Corinthians, is one whose laws will be inscribed in the hearts of God's people. Now, Hardy seems to have intended this scriptural passage to refer to marriage, where the contract of the institution kills joy and true love. Why, you may ask, does Hardy purposefully leave off the optimism inherent in the second part of what St. Paul says, namely that the Spirit giveth life? I will leave that question unanswered for the time being and let you dwell on it. So as we begin the novel, we are reminded that one of the overarching stories here is that Jude and Sue's family is quote-unquote cursed in marriage. Both Jude's parents and Sue's parents were divorced, and they also have an ancestor who was hanged for stealing his child's body from his estranged wife. Jude's parents, in fact, broke up near the Brown House, which plays so prominent a role in part first, and Jude's mother drowned herself. In part first of the novel, Drusilla, Jude's great-aunt, declares that the Follies aren't meant for marriage, as there is something in their blood that revolts against being sworn to love. So take a look at the first sentence. We'll skip the epigraph for part first. The schoolmaster was leaving the village, and everybody seemed sorry. Okay, so this is a very economic, straightforward sentence, right? It lacks the subtlety that you might find in the novels, say, of the American-British novelist Henry James, and maybe the colorfulness that you would find in the novels of the Polish-British novelist Joseph Conrad. The prose here is hard, graceless, spare, functional, maybe even uncivil. Hardy's not trying to accommodate his reader's sense of aesthetic refinement. His style is in your face. Now, of course, the novel is not in its entirety a reflection of this first sentence. Jude the Obscure broods on writing and literacy and copying and citation and scripture. It also has a lot of highly un-everyday English talk of theory and ideology. It uses words like paganism and Tractarianism. Yet at the same time, this is a raw and materialist work. In the first part of the novel, after all, we have a brutal pig killing, a false pregnancy, a suicide attempt, and, well, a lot of time just getting from place to place. Hardy refuses to combine or to synthesize these two modes or styles of writing. He refuses to bring all the theoretical and philosophical ideas his characters speculate about, especially Jude, down into the real world. You could say he refuses to dissolve high-minded ideas and theories into the lived texture of his narrative. So what we have is a novel that is materialistic, prosaic, pragmatic on the one hand, and a novel that is pretty aggressively theoretical on the other hand. One literary critic writes, quote, "How to be theoretical in the sense of providing nurturing, life-giving ideas, while not denying the body in the process, is one of the problems which Jude the Obscure confronts." End quote. And I think this is an accurate way of looking at what Hardy called, as you may remember in his preface to the novel, a deadly war waged between flesh and spirit. Okay, the first chapter gives us scenes that are a sort of prequel in which Hardy lays the foundation for the rest of the novel. Mary Green is a small pastoral town in Hardy's fictional Wessex County, which is based on the county of Dorset. The college town of Christminster in the distance immediately appears as an idolized destination. So Mary Green is set in opposition to Christminster, the unlearned, poor working class against the wealthy, well-born upper class with the leisure to study. The schoolmaster, Richard Phillotson, first acts as Jude's idol and his precursor in the dream of attending university. Then we get to part first, chapter 2. In the second chapter, Hardy lays out all his themes from the start. Jude is first presented as unwanted and unloved, and also cursed regarding marriage. Divorce was quite rare and frowned upon in the Victorian era, as you can imagine. Hardy immediately begins portraying Jude as a sympathetic, kindly character, one who is very sensitive to the suffering of others, but who is doomed to experience great suffering of his own. Jude's first job, in fact, is basically to be a living scarecrow, showing just how poor and alone he is. When Jude sets out toward the brown house at the end of Part 1, Chapter 2, he is trying to move from one class to another, which would have been nearly an impossible feat in his world. So let's take a look at a passage in this particular part, but in Chapter 2, on page 17, the longest paragraph on that page. Jude went out, and, feeling more than ever his existence to be an undemanded one, he lay down upon his back on a heap of litter near the pigsty. The fog had by this time become more translucent, and the position of the sun could be seen through it. He pulled his straw hat over his face and peered through the interstices of the plating at the white brightness, vaguely reflecting. Growing up brought responsibilities, he found. Events did not rhyme quite as he had thought. Nature's logic was too horrid for him to care for. That mercy towards one set of creatures was cruelty towards another sickened his sense of harmony. As you got older and felt yourself to be at the center of your time and not at a point in its circumference, as you had felt when you were little, you were seized with a sort of shuddering, he perceived. All around you there seemed to be something glaring, garish, rattling, and the noises and glares hit upon the little cell called your life, and shook it, and warped it. What an interesting paragraph. If you think of the sun as symbolic of the purpose of life, the destination at the end of life, the object of some aspiration, Jude is at 2 removes from it. He has to look through the interstices of the plating of the straw in his hat. And then he can see the fog. And then behind the fog, there is the sun. So Jude cannot see clearly, both literally and figuratively. The second half of the paragraph is wild. So for Jude, childhood is a time of a lack of responsibilities. It is a time when you are unaware of the horridness of nature's logic. You do not know yet that mercy towards one set of creatures was cruelty towards another. You have a sense of harmony that gets disrupted. As you got older, the narrator tells us, you feel not so much at a point in the circumference of your own time, but at the center of it. And you'd think that was a good thing, right? You'd think that going from the periphery to the center would be favorable to a sense of purpose and a sense of self. But here, the closer you get to the center of your time, the more aware, painfully aware you are of the logic of the universe. And though Jude comes up with a formula for that logic, or a part of it, mercy towards one set of creatures was cruelty towards another, much of the rest of nature's logic doesn't make any sense. All around you, there is something glaring, garish, rattling. And these noises and glares hit upon the little cell called your life, and they shake it and they warp it, and you cannot understand why this is happening or how this will happen. But you sense that something uncontrollable, mysterious, impenetrable is operating around the little cell called your life. As if to suggest that it's better to be in that little cell than poking your head out of it and staring at the chaos that surrounds you. The interesting thing about this paragraph is that Jude says afterwards, through the narrator, if he could only prevent himself growing up. That's the narrator speaking through what we call free indirect discourse, whereby a character's psyche is portrayed in the tense and person of third-person narration. Think of Jude saying, "If I could only prevent myself growing up." That's what the narrator is conveying. And the neat thing about free indirect discourse is that it looks like the narrator speaking, but it is also quite clear that the narrator is communicating what Jude is thinking. So there is a fuzziness about where statements like this come from. Jude, certainly, but technically on some level, the narrator filtering Jude. In any case, it's a very important paragraph for not only the first part of the novel, but for the rest of the novel, and its terms are good ones in which to think of what follows from this point. Okay, so let's think about chapter 3 of part first. So Jude walks a few miles north and comes to an old barn called the Brown House. He climbs a ladder onto the roof and he sees two men working. He tells them he's trying to find Christminster, and they say it's sometimes visible from the roof, but not today. Jude decides to wait until the weather clears, hoping to catch a glimpse of the city, which he thinks of as, quote, the heavenly Jerusalem, before he goes home. Dusk falls, and Jude prays to see Christminster, and eventually he sees distant lights and spires, quote, either directly seen or miraged in the peculiar atmosphere, end quote. Then he goes home, trying not to be afraid of the dark. In the following weeks, he dreams of Christminster and romanticizes not just the city, but, quote, the mentally shining ones therein. So one day he returns to the Brown House at dusk, waits for night to fall, and watches for Christminster from the roof. This time, instead of seeing individual lights, he sees a vague glow, kind of like the vague glow of the sun through the fog, through the plates of his straw hat. He imagines, this time, Eagleton in the light, like a holy figure. He thinks he hears the sound of bells or the voice of the city saying, quote, we are happy here. So he sees some men carrying coal pass by on the road during this vision, and he asks if they're coming from Christminster, and they're not. They tell Jude that the people of Christminster read books in languages that he will never understand, and it's, quote, nothing but learning, end quote, there. One man talks about the religion, music, and beauty of the city, though he admits that he's never been there. Jude heads home, suddenly feeling older and deciding that Christminster will be the goal of his life. And he declares to himself that it's a, quote, city of light, where the tree of knowledge grows, and decides that it will suit him perfectly. Okay, so an analysis of chapter 3. Here Jude shows his tendency for melodrama, idealism. He uses biblical language to describe earthly things. He builds up Christminster as his lifelong dream based upon hearsay and Eagleton's presence there, so it's almost inevitable that he will be disappointed someday. It's significant that Jude may not actually be seeing Christminster itself from the roof, but perhaps an imagined halo of light or another distant town altogether. He has no idea about the real Christminster, but builds up a specific image in his mind. Now you could argue that this is necessary if anything is to get done, worth being done in this world. Who knows? The latter part of chapter 3, with the men carrying coal, is kind of a comedic moment, since one of the men goes into great detail about Christminster, despite the fact that he's never been there. But it's also tragic for Jude, because he's now orienting his life around secondhand information. You can see that he seems pretty well-versed in biblical language, and he associates Christminster with a holy city, a kind of heavenly Jerusalem. And Christminster, we'll see, is not the only thing Jude idealizes. His cousin, Sue Bridehead, is the haloed apparition Jude sees in his aunt's photograph. And this is in part 2, chapter 1, when Jude sees, quote, the photograph of a pretty girlish face and a broad hat with radiating folds under the brim, like the rays of a halo. You almost think that the broad hat Sue is wearing in the photo is a clearer version of the straw hat the very young Jude was wearing when he was looking up towards the sun and realizing something about growth and development. In a word, both Christminster and Sue are elusive, and the desired city and the desired woman exist in their luminous purity only in Jude's imagination. Now, the Romantic poet would depict such an idealization as a wonderful thing and the glory of the imagination. Thomas Hardy, however, does not depict things quite like that. Okay, so let's talk about chapter 6. Now, this incident with Arabella was called by one of Hardy's foremost critics as, quote, more brutal in depravity than anything which the darkest slums could bring forth. Now, here's what Hardy says about it, and you can actually turn to the Norton Critical Edition, page 352. I'm talking, of course, about the way Arabella meets Jude. And Hardy says, in a particular letter on page 352, quote, the grimy features of the story go on to show the contrast between the ideal life a man wished to lead and the squalid real life he was fated to lead. The throwing of the pizzle at the supreme moment of his young dream is to sharply initiate this contrast. But I must have lamentably failed, as I feel I have, if this requires explanation and is not self-evident. The idea was meant to run all through the novel. It is, in fact, to be discovered in everybody's life, though it lies less on the surface, perhaps, than it does in my poor puppet's, that is, Jude's, life. So Hardy is shocked that people can't understand that he is trying to show us something truthful about our life, about everyone's lives, right? At the supreme moment of a dream, we are sort of met with a sharp contrast in the form of the antithesis of our dream. And this is another instance of the war between flesh and spirit that Hardy describes in his preface. And I think we can take Hardy at his word that the entire novel can be read through this perhaps disgusting, but in a way quite truthful incident. Speaking of the war between flesh and spirit, take a look at part 1, chapter 6, page 35. Arabella is pursuing Jude. The narrator says, perhaps she foresaw an opportunity, for somehow or other the eyes of the brown girl rested in his own when he had said the words, and there was a momentary flash of intelligence, a dumb announcement of affinity in passé between herself and him, which, so far as Jude Folly was concerned, had no sort of premeditation in it. She saw that he had singled her out from the three, as a woman is singled out in such cases, for no reasoned purpose of further acquaintance, but in commonplace obedience to conjunctive orders from headquarters, unconsciously received by unfortunate men when the last intention of their lives is to be occupied with the feminine. Now, if you detect a bit of misogyny in Jude's consciousness or the narrator's prose, you would not be inaccurate. One could also argue that the problem is not with generalizations about this sex or that sex, but with the conjunctive orders from headquarters that sort of appear without premeditation and only in a momentary flash of intelligence, and sort of dictate our behavior for us. Conjunctive just means having the effect of conjoining, connective. So Jude gets these orders from his mental headquarters, and they take over, and his reasoned interests lose their power. And Hardy seems to have a problem with the way human beings are biologically hardwired to act in ways not always conducive to their best interests. And if you take a look at a similar passage on 39, the idea is strengthened. Part 1, Chapter 7, top of page 39, the narrator says, "In short, as if materially, a compelling arm of extraordinary muscular power seized hold of him, something which had nothing in common with the spirits and influences that had moved him hitherto. This seemed to care little for his reason and his will, nothing for his so-called elevated intentions, and moved him along as a violent schoolmaster, a schoolboy he has seized by the collar, in a direction which tended towards the embrace of a woman for whom he had no respect, and whose life had nothing in common with his except locality." So the gist here is relatively simple. There are biological forces that do not care about how we rationalize or what we want, but will desire for us. Our biological instincts will do the thinking and subsequently the acting for us, whether we like it or not. What I think is interesting here is not just the gist, but the idea that Jude's irrational interest in Arabella seems to move him along as a violent schoolmaster would move along a schoolboy he has seized by the collar. So who else is a schoolmaster in this novel? Jude's idol, Richard Philipston. So in this sense, by means of a simile whose vehicle is a schoolmaster seizing a schoolboy by the collar, and whose tenor is some kind of set of biological impulses moving one along involuntarily. Through this simile, we have a foreshadow of the problem of idealizing Philipson, I think, although we are in a totally different context here. The point of both passages I've just read, though, is that to this Jude figure, biological instincts are at war. Flesh is at war with reasoned intentions, with will, with, in short, the spirit. All right, so let's take a look at chapter 7 in part first. The next day, after he meets Arabella, Jude wants to study Greek, but he decides it would be rude not to call on Arabella. So he arrives at her house, they go for a walk, and eventually they get to a pub where a picture of Samson and Delilah is hanging on the wall. Arabella shows Jude her surprising knowledge of liquor. They walk home in the dark, and Jude kisses Arabella several times. When they get to her house, Jude is surprised that her family thinks he's actually a serious suitor. He returns home and starts to wonder if he's wasting his life on books instead of loving a woman. The next day, Jude goes back to work at Alfredston, and an hour later, Arabella passes by the spot at which they kissed with her two friends, recounting to them all the details of the previous night, and declaring she wants to marry Jude. Her two friends, Sarah and Annie, propose that she try a special trick to catch Jude, if he happens to be an honest man. Arabella is confused, but her friends explain, saying that, quote, lots of girls do it, end quote, and it's the cause of many marriages. So Arabella decides to try it. Okay, so what's going on here? Well, the narrator pulls no punches in disparaging Jude's distraction from Christminster for Arabella's sake. Though Christminster is perhaps an idealized, impossible dream, Jude's fatal flaw is casting aside his future and, quote, higher nature for worldly pleasures. And of course, the picture of Samson and Delilah is an obvious warning for Jude. Samson being the biblical man of incredible strength who is seduced by Delilah, who cuts off his hair, the source of his power, arguably. Arabella also becomes associated with alcohol, Jude's other sensual weakness. And you should note that in this society, unlike ours, there is no quote-unquote casual dating, but only wooing with the intention to marry, or else a scandalous and sinful affair. Jude still tends towards melodrama and romance, while Arabella is narrow-minded and greedy. It's telling that Jude passes by the spot of their kiss and cherishes the memory, while Arabella passes by without even noticing. Hardy can never state it outright, but it becomes clear that Arabella's plan is to seduce Jude, get pregnant, or seem to, and then guilt him into marrying her. In this society, sex outside of marriage is a great sin and can only be rectified by a wedding. All right, so now for another passage, how about chapter 9, part 1, page 50, middle of the page. Quote, "And so, standing before the aforesaid officiator, the two swore that at every other time of their lives, till death took them, they would assuredly believe, feel, and desire, precisely as they had believed, felt, and desired during the few preceding weeks. What was remarkable, as the undertaking itself, was the fact that nobody seemed at all surprised at what they swore." Okay, so what can we make of this passage? Well, Jude has told Arabella that he thinks he should move away, and in response, Arabella has lied, telling him that she is pregnant. Although Jude believes this will signal the end of his dreams of going to Christminster, he nonetheless agrees to marry her, as he believes this is the honorable thing to do. In this passage, the narrator describes the marriage ceremony in detached language and frames it as a pact to believe, feel, and desire precisely as they had believed, felt, and desired during the few preceding weeks. Although marriage was a completely normal and central institution during the Victorian period, and still is, the narrator here seeks to defamiliarize it, showing how the very concept is strange and unrealistic. The narrator remarks that it was remarkable that nobody seemed at all surprised by the ceremony, suggesting that the reader, himself or herself, should feel surprised or alarmed by what has taken place. The narrator's words highlight the bizarre and arguably immoral nature of marriage by describing the vows as a promise to feel the same way forever. The way Jude and Arabella have felt in the short, tumultuous weeks they've spent together is now supposedly to automatically extend for a lifetime. This is alarming not only because of its unrealistic resistance to growth, maturity, and change, but also because the, quote, few preceding weeks, end quote, have been hardly ideal in the first place. Although they're sensually attracted to each other, it's clear that Jude and Arabella are not particularly compatible, and that the whole reason why the marriage is taking place is because Arabella lied to Jude, a rather worrying precedent for a lifetime of marriage. And here you can see Mary Wollstonecraft's A Vindication of the Rights of Woman entering. Wollstonecraft's solution to this problem is that marriage should not mean promising to feel the same way forever. That's not the point. For Wollstonecraft, marriage is a long-term friendship that begins in feeling and ought to end in rational comradeship. All right, so let's close our discussion of part 1 by looking at page 63. On the bottom, a little further on was the summit whence Christminster, or what he had taken for that city, had seemed to be visible. Notice the doubt in the very narrator's language here. A milestone, now as always, stood at the roadside hard by. Jude drew near it and felt, rather than read, the mileage to the city. He remembered that once, on his way home, he had proudly cut with his keen new chisel an inscription on the back of that milestone, embodying his aspirations. It had been done in the first week of his apprenticeship, before he had been diverted from his purposes by an unsuitable woman. He wondered if the inscription were legible still, and going to the back of the milestone, brushed away the nettles. By the light of a match he could still discern what he had cut so enthusiastically so long ago. Thither, J.F. The sight of it, unimpaired, with its screen of grass and nettles, lit in his soul a spark of the old fire. Surely his plan could be to move onward, through good and ill, to avoid morbid sorrow, even though he did see ugliness in the world. To do good cheerfully, which he had heard to be the philosophy of one Spinoza, might be his own even now. He might battle with his evil star and follow out his original intention. By moving to a spot a little way off, he uncovered the horizon in a northeasterly direction. There actually rose the faint halo, a small, dim nebulousness, hardly recognizable save by the eye of faith. It was enough for him. He would go to Christminster as soon as the term of his apprenticeship expired. He returned to his lodgings in a better mood and said his prayers. Okay, so it seems like Jude has escaped his disastrous marriage and can now return to his dream, though Hardy will later show that he can never truly be free of Arabella. Hardy seems to propose that we should battle against our tragic fates, but at the same time he shows how difficult this resistance usually is. The signpost becomes a potent image of Jude's youthful dreams. One critic points out that the fact that the word thither is on a stone monument is important. And the critic says, quote, "The act of embodying an aim in a word and cutting that word in stone," end quote, is deeply symbolic. She says the word here, quote, "falls into matter, becomes incarnate in paper or stone, and so partakes of the demands of material existence and becomes sinister, mocking, dangerous. The incarnate word takes the place of what it signifies, precludes its fulfillment. Incarnation means betrayal in this novel. To give or to take a body is to fall away from reality, to be involved in death," end quote. The point here seems to be that Jude lives or would live a spiritual existence, and everything related to his bodiliness, his earth-boundedness, his incarnate existence is, as he thinks, anathema to his dreams. He is quite influenced by the ontology of St. Paul, who separates spirit from flesh very, very carefully. From the writings of Plato and the writings of St. Paul and other church fathers, Jude is at war. Flesh and spirit. Now, one final word on determinism. So, actions in Hardy's novels are not shaped by some iron determinism. Now, people think they are, but I would argue that they are not. In the sense that his novels are not about some kind of cosmic, larger-than-life fatalism. If Jude's world is tragic, it's not because of some malevolent, implacable will somewhere presiding over the universe that determines everything in advance. In fact, I would argue the problem is just the opposite for Hardy. The world for Hardy is a flux, a randomness that evolves for no rhyme or reason toward where it will evolve. For Hardy, men and women can determine their actions, but the problem is that they can act so as to paint themselves into corners from which there's no escape. I think the ultimate point Hardy makes is, don't make your own perspective absolute. Don't see the world from your viewpoint only. The people in his fiction who do this end up hurt. Hardy implies that being stuck in your own standpoint is to become a kind of evolutionary cul-de-sac. It's to fail to adapt to a changing world. Now, in an evolutionary universe, again, everything is random. In the web of natural creation, for Hardy, everything is intricately bound up with everything else, so that your action at one point in this tangled social web can create effects where they are least expected. So for Hardy, again, you determine your own actions, but your actions are caught up in everyone else's actions. And in the end, you can't be master over the entire intricate web of human activity. Your actions may trigger a process that ultimately, taken along with everybody else's actions, no one can control. Countless people, for instance, may be involved even in the simplest action that you perform. So the point is, as we conclude part one with this brief discussion about so-called determinism in Hardy's novels, the point is that what looks like a predestined process in Hardy's novels, some kind of tragedy fated by the gods or by the cosmos, rarely is. In fact, and this is something to think about as you proceed through the rest of the novel, if you are careful, you can usually unravel the chain of cause and effect in the novels and see how things could have gone differently at any given point, if only certain decisions had been made that weren't, or if only certain decisions had not been made that were. So this concludes the lecture for part one of Jude the Obscure, and now we will move on to part two. So, part 2, chapter 1. 3 years after his marriage, Jude finally goes to Christminster. He's grown skilled at his craft of stoneworking, and he marches into town with his tools. He's partly motivated to move by having seen a portrait of Sue at his aunt's house. So he enters the town and takes lodgings in an area called Beersheba. He goes out at night and passes by the ancient, ornate college buildings. He wanders the empty streets and imagines the shade of dead philosophers and writers around him, and he converses aloud with them until a policeman comments on his odd behavior. He returns to his room, and as he falls asleep, he hears more quotations from the, quote, specters of different writers. The next morning, he remembers that he's here to find Mr. Phillotson and his cousin Sue. So, thinking about chapter 1, Arabella temporarily leaves the novel for a colony in Australia, as Hardy continues to foreshadow the approach of Sue, his other protagonist, and, like Jude, a progressive character. Jude seems on the right track in achieving his dream now. The distant halo of Christminster has become a real city. But though he's reached the real Christminster, he's still seeing it through the haze of his own idealism. As a stonemason, Jude's able to admire the beautiful old stonework and to add to his idolization of Christminster. He imagines the wondrous scholarship that must dwell inside these magnificent buildings. So Jude's interior life is so overwhelming that he can almost become delusional. The voices at Oxford almost remain incoherent. Jude seems to have a fragmented understanding of the city and its voices. There's a kind of collusion or mutual agreement here between Jude and the narrator. In Jude's first walk around Christminster, the names of these phantom scholars are withheld from the reader, though available to us in our footnotes, as if to convey the sense of a shared secret between narrator and character, between narrator and Jude. After this point, we can follow Jude's thoughts and actions because the narrator's examination of his consciousness is taken as authoritative. Now, this is important. Sue, by contrast, you could say is exhibited or pictorialized, that is, made into a picture or made into a kind of exhibit, rather than authoritatively conveyed. Her consciousness is opaque, filtered, as it is through the interpretations of Jude, with all their incomprehensions and idealizations and distortions. And it's Jude that makes of Sue's actions impulses, of her confused and complex emotions, flirtation, and of her motives, as Hardy puts it, quote, one lovely conundrum. So we see Jude authoritatively through the narrator, and we see Sue, by contrast, through the idealized consciousness of Jude Foley. In chapter 2, Jude looks at the portrait of Sue that we mentioned earlier, and his great-aunt Drusilla warns Jude not to try to find Sue. And here Drusilla acts as the voice of Hardy, you might say, warning Jude to avoid taking the wrong path, but perhaps knowing in advance that Jude has already chosen what will end up a tangled web of desire and frustration. This is confirmed when his aunt sends another letter to Jude in Christminster, warning about Sue. And what does Jude do? Well, he goes and he sees Sue anyway. He learns she works as a designer at a shop, and he watches her illuminating the word Alleluia on a scroll, and decides that she's innocent and saintly. And he leaves without revealing himself. So his first perception of Sue is that she's religious and pure, though we'll soon learn otherwise, at least as far as the religious part goes. Jude puts Sue on a pedestal, a common way of viewing women in Victorian times, but is also ensnared by her beauty. And afterwards, he follows Sue or seeks out her presence, but she doesn't notice he's there. He thinks that her refined nature comes from her work in London as a teacher, and wonders how one of his, quote, almost accursed stock could have reached such, quote, niceness or refinement. He begins to fall in love with her, but realizes that they could never marry because he's already married, for one, and also it's bad luck for cousins to marry, and also they are of the same family that's cursed regarding marriage. So he resolves to think of Sue only as a cousin and friend. So Jude has taken the, quote, curse of the Follies more to heart since his own bad marriage with Arabella, and because Sue is his cousin, she also falls under the same curse. His tendency towards idealism is now focused on Sue, as he prefers observing and romanticizing her from afar instead of actually talking to her, just as he longed for Christminster for years before actually going there. Okay, so Jude is finally gone to Christminster, and let's take a look at page 72 in the text. And I'm thinking in particular of the bottom of the page, 72. The narrator says, quote, "It was not till now, when he found himself actually on the spot of his enthusiasm, that Jude perceived how far away from the object that enthusiasm he really was. Only a wall divided him from those happy young contemporaries of his with whom he shared a common mental life, men who had nothing to do from morning till night but to read, mark, learn, and inwardly digest. Only a wall. But what a wall." Okay, so first Jude walks around Christminster in rapture. But in the morning, reality begins to sink in. He notices that the buildings are decayed and briefly considers the notion that being a stoneworker is perhaps as valuable as being a scholar. However, this thought doesn't last long. You see, it almost took hold of him, but didn't. And Jude ponders the, quote, wall that separates him and the students at Christminster. These thoughts reveal his insight as well as his naivete. Of course, much more than a wall separates Jude from Christminster students. At the same time, by exclaiming, "What a wall," Jude shows understanding of how the wall symbolizes the exclusivity and elitism of the university. Indeed, this passage raises complex questions about the relationship between material existence and the life of the mind. As Jude rightly infers, even an elite university like Christminster relies on the work of stonemasons and other manual laborers in order to function. Tragically, it is these workers who construct the very walls that then symbolize their exclusion from the institution within the walls. So we get to chapter 3. The narrative jumps back a few days. Sue has a holiday and walks through the country. Comes across a man selling sculptures of pagan gods and buys one of Venus and one of Apollo. The god of love, Venus, and the god of many things, Apollo, including poetry. Sue nervously wraps them up and brings them back to Christminster, quote, the most Christian city in the country, end quote. She takes them up to her room and is approached by Miss Fontover, her elderly landlady. The book now expands to include its second protagonist, the fascinating Sue Bridehead. And contrary to Jude's first impression of her, we see Sue rebelling against the Christianity of her surroundings by buying pagan statues and secreting them in her room. Chapter 4 shows us that Sue comes to the stonemason's yard while Jude's away. One of his co-workers mentions the visits, and Jude recognizes Sue by her description. He then finds a note from her in his lodging saying she will be leaving Christminster soon, so he immediately writes back and proposes to meet her outside. She agrees, but finds that the particular place Jude chooses is, quote, gloomy and inauspicious in its associations. They greet each other bashfully. Now, we don't learn this until later, but Sue associates their meeting place with the curse of the Follies regarding marriage. She also has grown up a child of divorce and heard the same advice, never to marry. She breaks through Jude's idealism, however, by coming to see him herself instead of acting as some distant, almost holy figure. Later on, the two find Phillidston. Now, Phillidston was Jude's precursor and idol, and his failure to be accepted at Christminster does not bode well for Jude. Phillidston's failure, that is. He's still a relatively successful schoolmaster, but he lacks Jude's fierce and arguably hopeless ambition and is willing to settle for something less than ideal. In chapter 5, Sue starts working for Phillidston right away, and it's part of his responsibility to give her private lessons. But according to the law, they have to have a chaperone with them during these. Now, Phillidston thinks this is unnecessary because of their age difference, but he still finds himself growing attracted to Sue. A few weeks later, they all visit a model of Jerusalem in Christminster, where the students they teach are going to visit. And here Hardy offers another subtle critique of Victorian views of sexuality. That is, with respect to the chaperone business. The law cannot conceive of a man and a woman studying together in private without also having sex. So they must have a chaperone. Now, you could say that this is unjust, both for denying any potential for sexuality in any given situation, and for assuming that two humans cannot be anything but slaves to their desires. So move on to chapter 6. Drusilla grows ill. Jude returns to Mary Green to visit her. And of course, she's angry that Jude has been seeing Sue and tells Jude some stories about how immodest and precocious Sue was as a child. And Jude meets some villagers at Mary Green who are surprised that he hasn't gotten into college yet. How disappointing. They remind him of his old dreams and his worship of Christminster and say that they were confirmed in their suspicions. Colleges are only for the rich. Jude is struck by their words, and he resolves to renew his attempts to enter a college. He writes letters to 5 influential professors, explaining his circumstances and requesting advice. He waits a long time with no response and starts to despair. And one day he awakens from his dream and recognizes that the privileges of university are not for people like him, but only for the lucky upper classes. He wishes that he could at least have Sue to console him. When he finally does receive a response from a professor, the professor reminds him to remain in, quote, his own sphere, and Jude gets depressed, drunk, and wanders the streets. So we can analyze chapter 6. Jude's become distracted by a woman again, though Sue is painted as much more worthy of his devotion than Arabella was. Drusilla acts as the foreboding prophet, reminding Jude to struggle against his, quote, evil star, end quote. And the people of Marygreen are basically right, but Jude can never give up his dream. Christminster is Hardy's great symbol of the unfairness of his society, especially regarding education. The university should be a place encouraging new ideas and fresh intelligences, but instead it has limited itself to the upper classes and whoever can buy their way in. Recall that in Part 2, Chapter 2, the narrator says, quote, "What at night had been perfect and ideal was by day the more or less defective real," end quote. So in Part 2, Chapter 6, we see that the, quote, defective real of Christminster is made explicit in the professor's letter. Jude is punished for trying to push against his social role and change his status for the better, a pattern that will repeat itself later within this domestic situation. We've seen Hardy critique religion, but it's also true that he identifies most of his characters with biblical figures. Jude is often compared to Christ or Job, both of whom suffered for seemingly no reason. And the last thing I want to do is talk about Chapter 7. Jude feels like a fool. Sue is the only one he thinks with whom he has some true affinity, but she is forever cut off from him by his own disastrous marriage. So he goes to a tavern where some other stonemasons are drinking, and they start talking about colleges, and Jude curses the professors for rejecting him, claiming that he's smarter than most of them. Uncle Joe, one of Jude's companions, challenges Jude to recite the Nicene Creed in Latin to prove his academic prowess. Now imagine if you were at a pub drinking an IPA and someone challenged you to quote the Creed in Latin. And Jude recites the Creed, but he gets angry when everyone applauds him, storms out, walks to Lumsden and knocks on Sue's door. She lets him in, calms him down, puts him to bed. At dawn, he wakes up and is ashamed that Sue has seen him in this state, so he slips out of the house without waking her. He realizes then that his employer has left a note dismissing him for missing work. He walks to Marygreen feeling miserable and downtrodden, but a, quote, poor Christ, end quote, figure. There he meets his great aunt by the town well, and then goes to stay with her in his old room. He wakes up feeling that he is a failure both in ambition and in love, as he puts it. So he wanders about the town and meets Mr. Highridge, a clergyman. Jude confesses his plight and failed dreams, and Highridge says that perhaps Jude could enter the church as a licentiate if he gives up drinking. Now, a licentiate is one who has received a license from a university, but not a degree. In current British use, the term is almost exclusively in certain designations, indicating that the bearer of the license has received a formal attestation of professional competence, or of a certain degree of proficiency in some art, but not a degree. So the great tragedy of the marriage-centric aspect of the novel is that Jude and Sue are truly compatible and seem to be, as it were, soulmates, but they are prevented from being together by the rigidity of the institution of marriage. And Jude, again, turns to alcohol in his depression. All of his hard work and study is only good for impressing people at a bar, he thinks, people who have no idea if he is speaking Latin correctly or not. Now, it's ironic that Jude recites the traditional declaration of faith, even as he seems at this point in the novel to have lost faith in everything he previously believed in, although he is inspired by what the clergyman in Marygreen tells him. Again, Jude compares himself to a biblical figure, this time Jesus, though Jude feels he has degraded himself by drinking during his quote-unquote martyrdom. It was unjust that Christminster didn't accept him, but Jude also hurts his cause by turning to alcohol when he faces failure. At the close of Part 2, he seems to be following in Philipston's footsteps again, giving up the dream of Christminster, but still hoping to be successful within his own social sphere as a licentiate, just as Philipston decides to become a schoolmaster instead of taking a degree at Christminster. The problem is that Jude's religious faith is not as strong as his idealistic ambition and tendency towards sensual pleasures. Okay, so that ends the lecture for part 2 of Jude the Obscure. And I will see you when we continue in a shorter lecture, but one no less interesting and exciting, about part the 3rd of Jude the Obscure.